Thank you and welcome to the Cannabis Matrix Podcast. I am super excited today because I have with me Dr. Karymaitre Aliffe.
I brought you a rose.
Oh, Dr. Aliffe is a forward-looking entrepreneurial physician-scientist and a good friend of mine whom I've had the privilege of learning a lot about cannabis over the past couple years. Dr. Aliffe actually started teaching mathematics at Harvard University when he was 19. He did his undergraduate at Harvard and is a STANFORD-TRAINED physician scientist. He is a multilingual biomedical executive and an engaging public speaker with over 25 years in strategic visionary leadership, leveraging breakthrough science into novel therapies. We're going to talk a little bit about that today with the endocannabinoid system and medicinal agents, including cannabinoid-centered biotechnology. So welcome, Dr. Aliffe. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Jake.
Tell me what got you interested in the space of learning about medical cannabis. We'll start with a big picture.
Oh, well, it's actually what got me started really in medicinal chemistry overall about 40 years ago when Dr. Candace Pert's work on the opiate system, endogenous opiate system came out. I was taking, organic chemistry, biochem and all that when, some professor happened to pop that in, in some lecture. And I was like, wow, you mean these molecules here bind to a specific receptor in the body as though they were designed for it. And the molecules that they match up with don't look anything like them. They're not even the same class of molecule. So that to me just blew me away. That was like the most amazing thing to me, finding pharmacologically specific molecules in plants that are specific to human receptors is like the same as for astrophysicists finding a parallel universe. And because it's completely like there's no reason why the botanical universe should be making medicine for human brain.
So just to refresh for our audience, our brain cells have these receptors on them. There's an analogy that is a little oversimplified called the lock and key analogy. But basically what you're saying is that 600 million years ago, individual cells developed these very complex receptors. It's a very intricate kind of a molecular shape that will turn on these receptors. And coincidentally, so that was 600 million years ago. The plant, about 200 or less million years ago, developed a whole different set of molecules for a whole different set of purposes that just so happens to coincidentally fit exactly into the receptors in our on our nerve cells and in the various cells of our body. So that is a very intricate coincidence, is what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's beyond coincidence, because I think if you do the mathematics, to render it a coincidence is ridiculous, because the likelihood that it would happen by chance and be so specific, and then to find it over and over again from the opiate system, the endocannabinoid system, other systems, it just, the thought that these systems are so separate that, that the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom and our individual species are so isolated is ridiculous. And of course, 40 years ago, they hadn't done genome mapping, DNA mapping and all that. So, we didn't realize that everything on the planet is 90 to 95% related, whether it's a worm or flower or whatever. And so anyway, that was what got me involved in this space and interested in things like cannabinoids and endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system hadn't been discovered yet, because, I'm talking like 1979, 1980, and the endocannabinoid system, as far as finding endogenous receptors, wasn't until 1990s. But at the time, it was the opiate system, and then I ended up doing research while I was at Harvard looking at tumor-promoting agents based on what used to be called a two-stage and now a multi-stage model of carcinogenesis that said that you have a substance or an incident, a mutation incident on a cell, but that's not sufficient to convert it into a cancer. It just becomes a transformed cell. And that there are other circumstances or other agents, chemical, physical agents, that then can trigger this rapid growth, uninhibited growth that we associate with malignancy. So, the first stage is initiation of transforming a normal cell into a malignant cell. And that can happen, like, say, with, radiation, gamma radiation, kind of Fukushima, Hiroshima sort of thing. But then the second stage that somehow initiates this further aggression, mutation, whatever you might want to call it, to where you have this cell that grows uncontrollably and invasively, and in some ways is I have the word cannabis in my head, and I want to say cannibalistic, because often cancer cells will actually consume normal cells that are adjacent to them. Yeah.
I did.
It's a pretty wild thing, So anyway, it turns out, the cigarette smoke has initiator molecules that, can cause the mutation, and also has promoter molecules that then can promote the growth of those cells, kind of like fertilizer, like Easy Grow or whatever that stuff is called that they have in the garden center, and Miracle Grow, I guess it's called. Anyway, so I was working in that space, and there were 3 molecules of distinctly different chemical families. I won't go into the details of it, but they're from completely different spaces, completely different chemistry. One from fungus, one from blue-green algae, and one from a plant in India. And they had completely different structures. They all bind to the same receptor. And ironically, it's in the protein kinase C space, which is right in that same receptor complex space with the endocannabinoid system. When you look at phospholipase A and all of that, they're right there, part of that same complex that's involved in, prostaglandin synthase and that whole complex that either goes in the direction of inflammation, which is the direction of carcinogenesis, or it goes in the direction of the generation of endocannabinoids and, other lipid-based communicator, molecules, hormones, or, that space. So that's, my fascination with cannabis isn't, the usual space of, growing it in your backyard or going to a Grateful Dead concert and all that. It's very kind of quantum molecular sort of geeky stuff.
Fascinating. Now, how you mentioned a bunch of different systems, the endocannabinoid system, you mentioned the opiate system. How do you, and there are so many other systems in the body, how do you see the endocannabinoid system as being different than, say, for example, the endogenous opiate system or another system like that?
Well, it's easier for me to talk about similarities first, I guess, because that's the way I think. So we face a challenge in science because in order to go into science and do this kind of research, you have to prove to people that you're smart. Once you're convinced that you're smart, it's hard to then accept that you don't know what you're doing. And that's kind of what discovery requires. You have to be convinced, you have to be confident enough to feel like you're smart enough to figure out what's going on, and also be humble enough to say, but I have no idea, because once we sail past this next meridian, we're beyond the map. Right. We don't really know what's going on. We may go off the edge of the world, or we may end up someplace we have no idea. And so in science, it's challenging, I would say, to find people that are smart enough to do the work, that are humble enough to say the I don't know part. So I mention that because every time we find one of these so-called systems, it's because of molecules that come to us from the so-called natural world, which is the only world I know. But they're not synthetic chemicals coming from a pharmaceutical company, meaning that. So whether it's, morphine as an opium extract, whether it's cocaine as a coca leaf extract, whether it's aspirin as an extract of, white willow bark.
Nicotine from tobacco.
Nicotine from, the whole Solanaceae family, really. And, even chili pepper leaves have nicotine in it. And so...
I did not know that. Okay. Huh.
Yeah, it's abundant in the whole family, but they've got a lot of noxious compounds in that family. And so,
potatoes are in that family too, correct?
Pardon?
Potatoes are also Solanaceae.
Yeah, potatoes, tomatoes, eggplant, chili peppers, and of course, deadly nightshade. I mean, that's the nickname for the family. And that's why in Europe they were afraid of it, because it's a very toxic plant. So, you wouldn't want some of those characteristics of deadly nightshade or, chili peppers in your tobacco smoke, because you could really cause yourself trouble when you're smoking. But anyway, so these different natural substances have been our teachers. They've been the probes in the universe, internal universe of the human body, to teach us about messenger systems, messenger molecules, the communication systems and the dynamics within the central nervous system, with all of the ion channels and the receptors and the vesicles and this whole thing. You have to have ways of triggering it. Especially when you're working with, either an ex vivo, like with an animal that's been dissected, or in vitro in a petri dish or in a test tube. You've got to figure out, okay, well, how do I make this nerve think that I just stepped on its foot? So I can see what happens when you step on somebody's foot. And it just so happens there's a lot of molecules running around that, a lot of times are associated with poisons, because humans notice these negative effects, these deleterious effects. You eat this plant, you die. Okay, let's figure out what did that. You eat this fish, like the Japanese puffer fish, which has tetrodotoxin, and it's a nerve toxin. And so that's been instrumental in learning how, the just basics of nervous cell, neuronal function and communication.
So you're.
So I mentioned all that because without cannabinoids, we wouldn't know the endocannabinoid system was there. Without opium poppy, we wouldn't know that the opium poppy was there. Cocaine is a local anesthetic. We still don't really understand, I should say whoever, it's still not understood completely how local anesthetics work when you look at the whole family of them that have been developed from cocaine.
Yeah.
And so, there's some ion channels that are blocked and they're different, but it's not like so lock and key like people like for it to be. So I mention all that to say, okay, we've got this probe and it's a cannabis plant, and it's got 100-some molecules that are very similar and that are called cannabinoids.
Yeah.
And two of them dominate from a mass standpoint, are the majority of milligrams per gram are either THC or CBD. And even those two don't do the same thing, even though there are isomers of one another. They have the same chemical formula. They just have slightly different structure. So you got huge diversity. You got these twin brothers or sisters that have completely different personalities. THC's personality is so different from CBD. And for us to think that these are the only two members of that family that interact with the endocannabinoid system, to think that we now know the whole thing because, THC binds here and here, CB1, CB2. Okay, we've got it. I think that there's a system, a communication system in the body, kind of like the internet or telephone or whatever you might want to call it, that has multiple layers and systems and control systems and all of that. And it's kind of like trying to figure out the internet with one smartphone, and you kind of, you hit a button and somebody sends you a text message. That's like the smallest piece of the internet. And that's kind of what, we're doing with cannabis. We have a way to send the message into this big system, and it does a couple of things, and it sends back a few emoticons. It sends back a smiley face instead of a frown, and it sends back a sunny day instead of a cloudy, rainy day. And we're like, whoa. Okay, I understand the system. This is like, come on, man. All you did was send a text.
Right. All you did was, and so just a kind of, so we have this plant that makes hundreds of beneficial medicinal chemicals, compounds. And we have two major stars in the media, CBD and THC. And as you mentioned, they're isomers of each other. So that means they have the same number of carbon atoms. They have the same number of oxygen, the same number of hydrogen. It's just that they're slightly different. And that gives them, and you said that they're like twins. So
they are. I mean, from a molecular standpoint, they are.
But with very different personalities, like some twins have. Can you speak a little bit to that difference? Because I think that where we might be going with our talk today is a kind of a broad overview of this endocannabinoid system, but we live in a media culture where CBD is getting a lot of very good press and has been over the last couple of years. THC mixed, I think that you can make the argument at best, and a lot of the negative press for cannabis comes through THC. So could you talk to the difference in the personalities of how THC affects this, either the endocannabinoid system or human physiology versus the personality of CBD?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you've got these two molecules. Like I said, they are twin brothers or sisters, siblings, and they have the same, if you will, genetics. They have the same molecular structure. They just have a slight difference in the way, they are put together, and almost kind of like one of them is right-handed and the other one is left-handed. For all the chemical purists out there, I won't say that because that'll make them claim enantiomers, and it's not true. So anyway, but the point is that, when these two guys are young, you can kind of tell them apart because, their hair pattern is a little different, or hair color, eye color is a little different, some sort of thing. And as they get older, say THC, CBD was born first. It was discovered first, right? THC was second. But THC was, at 3 years old, was a little bit funnier, a little bit more charismatic. The aunts and uncles and neighbors, when they come by, they liked, the THC, let's say his name is, Thibodeau or something, Theodophilus or whatever, THC. And it's like, oh, he's so funny. He tells funny jokes. He makes everybody laugh. And that's fine. And that's really great. And the other one, CBD, Carl, we can call him, is just, kind of more quiet. Doesn't really seem to have like an obvious impact, kind of sits by himself. And, it's just not as popular. And so for a long time, THC is way more popular. But as THC comes of age in the modern culture, a couple thousand years after this family is born, you have this current culture where as an adult, people expect THC to not get people high. We've got to go to work. You've got to be responsible. THC is making you fall asleep. THC will make you irresponsible. And so suddenly THC is kind of not the favorite twin anymore. And CBD is, because CBD gets really good grades in school. And
you can take CBD and go to work and perform at your job very well. What you don't want to do is take that THC, well, maybe you do, but what most people do, and go to work and run a meeting or something like that. So culturally...
Yeah, so I put the plant before the culture.
Okay,
especially
put the plant, okay.
And so the culture doesn't interact optimally with the plant. And that's the same with tobacco. That's the same with, sugar cane.
Okay.
This culture doesn't interact very well with sugar. They refine the sugar and make it into a poison.
But
tobacco,
however, yes,
whatever, you can go down the list.
An example of a plant molecule that works very well with this culture would be caffeine, for example. Would you agree?
I would say that it doesn't.
Oh, really?
I would say that the culture likes it.
Yes.
I don't think it helped the culture.
Okay, a better way of phrasing it. The culture, because what does caffeine do? It gives you focus. You get the job done. It go, and that type of a thing. Versus THC. Now, talk to the importance of THC, because I see, and I think that you do too, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. I see THC as an incredibly useful therapeutic molecule. It just commands a little bit of a different type of a respect than CBD. But talk to a little bit about the usefulness of either of them separately, and then also a little bit about the entourage effect, about both CBD,
Sure.
THC, etc., being used together.
Yeah, so the thing is that in this culture, people like for people to drive themselves until they drop. And people admire the martyr. People admire the person that just, they run until they have a heart attack. And that person can be replaced on the assembly line, and then, work goes on. And so the guy had a heart attack, he'll be replaced by his son. The woman had a stroke or breast cancer or something, and she'll be replaced by her daughter or whatever. And this thing, so the individual well-being is not of paramount concern in this culture. You got to earn a lot of money in order to get to a point where you have the right to take the privilege of caring about yourself and how you feel and all that, from the level of being homeless or subsistence level in the so-called third world and all those sorts of things. There's a long way that a person has to go before they can just take a day off on a Thursday and go to the beach because they want to.
Okay, yeah.
And so the problem is that THC makes you feel like taking off work and going to the beach.
So, yes. Or play music, or cook a meal, or watch some interesting film, that kind of thing. Okay.
Right. So the thing is that when you work for a corporation, the corporation is not really interested in your well-being, typically, unless you're like, executive or whatever. But if you're just an entry-level plebe, then, you having a smile on your face is not in the interest of the corporation. And so this culture has like an, industrialized mentality of work. Oh, it's 8 o'clock in the morning. I've got to be at work. People get in rush hour traffic. They're all trying to get to work at the same time. They spend an hour and a half in commute and just to get to work that pays them barely enough. I mean, there's this thing.
Mm-hmm. Go.
If you give those people THC, the whole thing will fall apart because people are driven by the stress and the survival venture and the competition.
Mm-hmm.
And if you put THC in there and even CBD, really, especially if you put them in there together, and you take away stress, anxiety, depression, and pain from people, how many people are still going to go to work?
Well,
How many people are still going to study for their boards and bar exams and all those things if they're feeling like, it's okay. It's not the end of the world if I don't, get into this neurosurgery program.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the drive that people have is based on this stress model. And so if you take away stress, if you take away war, if you take away, things like the conflicts that drive people, red state, blue state, and you get people to a point where it's like, hey, you know what? It's not such a big deal. You got a Republican president for 4 years. No worries. We just had a Democrat. Hey, let's go out to the beach. Let's go have a picnic in the park, play the guitar.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That would be a very different society.
Yeah.
And so a lot of things depend on people being driven by that. Sports, we say that people are playing basketball or playing football, but it's really not playing because people don't want to lose.
At a certain level, absolutely, it becomes not about play anymore, for sure.
Yeah. So that's
Big
the
business.
challenge with THC. THC puts a human being in an altered state of mind, which is not so compatible with a success orientation in this culture.
It's not compatible with running yourself ragged. If you are exhausted and you have a little bit of THC, you may get an initial lift, but at a certain point in time, you're going to be snoozing on the couch.
Which is what the body needs.
So there's this dichotomy.
So that's part of the challenge.
And that's one of the main criticisms of THC is that it has this amotivational syndrome. However, what is the proper motivation for somebody whose adrenals are burnt out, that has been overworked and overstressed for months and months, may even have some underlying nutritional deficiency from that system working overtime? And admittedly, any look at the history of reefer madness sees that there has been a clash with this plant and that part of our culture for a long time. Comes along CBD, which, by the way, as you mentioned, was discovered before THC, but when they isolated it and gave it to humans, they didn't get high, so people thought that must not be it. And so skip forward to Raphael Mechoulam and the discovery of THC and the receptor system. We are now only just now, even though CBD was discovered, I think, in the early 1940s, figuring out how it all works.
But why? Why? Because if you look at the society now compared to the 1940s, we have a lot of interests now that people didn't have in the 1940s. Like I mentioned, one of the side effects of affluence is luxury.
Yes.
So people have the luxury now to want to cure cancer, eliminate PTSD. I mean, do they really think that nobody came back from World War II with PTSD? I mean, come on. There were lots of
they called it shell shock.
A diagnosis.
Yeah,
and it just wasn't a diagnosis for it.
Yeah.
You just have to go back and work on the farm or have a job because there really wasn't another option for a man to be other than.
And the guys wouldn't. Most of them were guys. They wouldn't talk about it. I mean, the old timers. That was just.
There's no space for it. Yeah. So that's what I'm saying is that so we have a more affluent culture now, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot more leisure time. Mm-hmm. And so that gives people time to consider some of these other things. But the thing about THC is, like I said, the kid is very impactful. Okay, the THC, it impacts people. That gives people a sense of power. If I can give a drug to somebody, say to some woman I want to dance with, and she said no, and I put the drug in her drink, and she starts laughing and dancing, and I said, well, let me dance with you. And she says, sure. That's power.
Right.
Okay, that's very appealing to people.
Right.
So when you find THC and you give it to people and they change their emotional state distinctly, wow, that impresses humans as competitive animals going back to whatever beginning of time one wants to draw a line to. But CBD is subtle. Mm-hmm. From our understanding, it's like, okay, if everything is fine, if you're, well-fed, reasonably well-rested, and you just kind of have irritations, you don't have these major problems. Mm-hmm. You're not being, chased by a lion. You're not, you have these things. You have a fairly settled, reasonable lifestyle, but you're having trouble sleeping. Mm-hmm. But you're feeling a little weird about having shot all those children in Vietnam or Iraq or whatever.
Okay.
The time that people have to sit and reflect on that then creates a therapeutic opportunity that previously, it wouldn't have existed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, that's why THC is a standout, because in this culture, again, cannabis was looked at as a mind-altering substance. It was being studied because of that mind-altering
Specifically,
effects.
that was what they thought it did.
Right.
I mean, that was the main thing that they thought it did. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And so the thing is, if you look at dosages, and it's kind of like the thing with microdosing, and even with LSD and psilocybin and a lot of these other compounds that are psychoactive, there's a dose response curve.
Sure.
Okay. And so THC doesn't get you high. It's a certain amount of THC has a certain effect. But if in this culture, a lot of people are trying to escape a certain level of stress or feeling oppressed or whatever it is, if you're trying to depart the state that they're normally at when they haven't taken any substances in other than nutritional, let's say, substances, and then they take in these other substances and they have an altered state. And if people are seeking that altered state, it must mean that their basic state, their foundation state, isn't that desirable. Okay, and so then that is a motivation to consume and perhaps overconsume. But that's the same thing with alcohol. Like I said, with LSD, it could be marijuana, it could be anything that is freeing people up from the chatter of their lives, the screaming, the terror, whatever it is. And if it's a temporary or a permanent departure, that sort of a thing. So that, if you had you probably heard of these. I mean, it's anecdotal, right? Ram Dass and the Tibetan lamas and all that, and giving them LSD.
The yogis. What was his? Anyway, yeah, they took Ram. So just for our audience, Ram Dass was he was at Harvard as well. Taught psychology there and was involved with Timothy Leary. I believe they had offices right next door to each other in Harvard, and Timothy Leary said, "Hey, LSD." And it cracked open Ram Dass's mind. He went to India and studied spirituality there, and was also an LSD proponent at the time. And he had met this holy man, or I don't know if there were many, but the holy man was like, I'd like to try that. And they gave, it was Maharishi was his name. They gave him, I think, and I'm not sure if it was only once, but it was at least once, a pretty substantial dose of LSD. And his report was that nothing was changing for him. Now, my question to you was, do you think an advanced being, assuming that was what was going on, has a different endocannabinoid system set up? And talk to the audience about how we may use these molecules to change our own endocannabinoid system. It might fit into that story that you're talking about there.
Yeah, it's, that my perception of the endocannabinoid system is people call it homeostasis. And I think that's a nice word, but I think that the underlying human interpretation of that is flawed. Because people have this concept of this ideal, normal state that everybody should be, and everybody should be, 70 kilogram male, and 5'11" and whatever. There's just all these things, these norms.
This perfect idea.
Right. And life, I would say, biological life is not that way. There are different climate zones. The Sahara Desert is different from the Polynesian Islands, which is different from the Arctic and Antarctica, and it's different from the temperate zones, places like London and New York City and Tokyo. Okay. And so if you have a single organism called a human being, and it is being designed to thrive in any of those environments, it needs a way to modify its biochemistry and physiology in such a way that it can interact successfully with those different environments. So, is the ideal state to be this or this or this? The ideal body type for the Sahara may not be the ideal body type for, say, an Eskimo. So, you have your, Saharan, Bedouin nomads or Berbers or something. Should they have the same endocannabinoid system as the Inuits or the Eskimos? And so, to me, if this person that Ram Dass gave LSD to is already living in a state where there's no rush hour traffic, where there's no, high tension, electrical wires generating these huge electromagnetic fields that affect, the human brain, body, nervous system also. If they're outside of that space, then it's different. I mean, a human being feels different. I've worked in the Amazon for extended periods of time. It's different living, not just visiting and taking some ayahuasca, but actually living in the Amazon in a hut with people that have lived there their whole lives. It's very different than living in New York City or LA.
Sure.
It's very, very different. It's just, it's just a different experience. And if you're staying there long term, why would your body not begin to adapt? There are all of these differences. Suddenly there's no traffic sounds. There are no sirens going off. There's no television. Maybe you even start to talk differently because you don't need to yell to be heard over the person sitting next to you in Starbucks.
And I noticed that, they call, like when you go to Hawaii, Jamaica, St. Thomas, everybody talks about island time. And I noticed that when I get on island time, my gait changes. I walk much more slowly. I'm not in a hurry, that kind of a thing.
Right. So mentioning what you're talking about is a cultural effect that was noticed in the colonial period. So you got a bunch of people coming from London colonizing the Caribbean or coming from Madrid, from Spain, and colonizing what we call Latin America now, and suddenly finding themselves in these tropical places. And aside from dengue and yellow fever and malaria and all that, there's just this different thing. And it's like the old song says, only mad dogs and Englishmen run around in the midday sun. There's this clash because, even when I was a kid in cartoons, they would make fun of Mexicans, the stereotype of the Mexican siesta. They wouldn't mention that they do the same in Spain, but that in midday that people would rest.
Right.
Well, that's common all around.
And healthy, especially
Italy,
in a hot climate. Especially.
Yeah. So you find in Italy and Spain and a lot of those countries that the middle of the day is when people go home for a long, what we would call lunch, but it's the larger meal of the day. People leave work, they go home. Stores may be open from 8 in the morning until 2 p.m. and then open again at 6 p.m. until 10. And that's right now. That's modern, and that's like Anglo-Saxon people. It's not like, oh well, these are islanders and these are white or something. No, it's a different zone. The tropics are a different space, and so that effect that you're talking about, island time, is kind of like THC.
Yeah.
And so people find themselves not being so punctual or having it's all good, Hakuna Matata.
And just to rewind, that can be a healthy way of being.
It is, yeah. But when you come from a culture where you feel like somebody will steal your job, if not your wife or your husband, if you let your guard down, if you don't
There's
lock the
20
doors,
other people lined up ready to go. But you mentioned something about the endocannabinoid system that I thought was fascinating from the perspective of a boxer, but we can use it from the perspective of anyone, a fisherman, a yogi, but that we'll use the boxer's experience of getting punched in the face versus my experience of getting punched in the face. I haven't been punched in the face in a number of decades. Probably deserved it when it happened way back then. But my reaction, or a typical person's reaction to getting hit in the face versus a boxer's reaction, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was at a conference, and it was the World Boxing Federation, something like that. And anyway, talking about traumatic brain injury and just showing that an example of the different states that human beings can exist in, showing that the same stimulus can have a very different meaning and very different response and experience to a different person.
Yes.
And so even again, if it's twin brothers, like, THC and CBD or whatever, and you hit one guy in the face and he's a boxer, and hit the other guy in the face and, he's a classical pianist or something, they're likely to have very, very different responses because the boxer has primed his entire system, let's just say, to use a vague term, to getting hit in the face. And so his response to getting hit in the face is to not fall down, is to not feel pain, is to not be embarrassed in front of the people, friends and family that are watching him at the boxing match. There's his dad. He wants to make his dad proud, and his girlfriend or whatever, And so
his survival mechanisms are different.
I wouldn't necessarily even call it survival.
Okay.
Because I don't think he's in survival mode when he's boxing, because he's already there.
He's not, because he's been there before.
Yeah. So to me, it's more like a hunter, who's out hunting, and maybe he's hunting, a predatory animal like a lion. But he knows a lion could kill him, but his response to that lion is very different than my response would be if I'm in Tanzania someplace and I get up in the morning and, open the front door of my little cabin. Boom, there's a lion. It's like, whoa. Okay, I wasn't planning to have any interactions with a lion. Yeah. So my response would be more like the fight and flight and fear and all of that. Whereas the guy who's the hunter, it's like, oh, somebody delivered me a lion. Let me get my gun. Okay. And so, but there's an entire process in the brain, because the endocannabinoid system has the ability to modify incoming neural signals. from the periphery and also within the central nervous system, because it does retrograde firing.
Yeah.
Meaning that when you have two neurons communicating, and it's like you have a fist and a hand, kind of like the Shaolin greeting, wushu or whatever,
Yeah.
And so the hand is over the fist, and the hand is open hand is communicating to this fist. That's like two neurons. And usually it only goes in one direction, from the open hand down into the fist and through that arm, which is the neuron, out to wherever it goes. Okay. And the retrograde transmission is saying the fist is communicating back to the hand, and it's giving it information. Mm-hmm. And so, the classic kind of, model that I use is like a teenager being yelled at by his or her parents to, do their homework, turn off the video games, clean up the room, go to bed, whatever, that sort of thing. And there's just certain signal that's like, rah, 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 and when you close the door to your room so you don't have to hear all that noise, the noise is still there, but you've just given a retrograde signal to limit the transmission of that signal. So now it's not as stressful. Okay?
So that the endocannabinoid system the nervous system can use it to monitor and regulate its own stress as opposed to be controlled.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah, well, because to me, it's not stress. If I walk away from, like I said, if I'm willing to start all over again with the endocannabinoid system and say, I don't really know anything. All I know is a certain version, but I don't know, like, globally know things. And so stress is our description. When I was in medical school, the official medical opinion on stress was that it did not exist. I remember having the conversation with professors, and people were saying things like, well, high blood pressure and strokes and heart attacks were caused by stress, and they're like, there's no such thing as stress.
No, it's the kidneys, dummy. It's the kidneys.
Yeah, and so they refused to accept it. I had a professor one time tell me that there's no salt in your sweat because the body's homeostatic mechanisms hold on to the sodium chloride, and so when you sweat, it's just other substances, but there's no salt in it. And I told him, I said, he's crazy, because I had a roommate who was from Nigeria. We used to play soccer together. And when he would sweat, when we were playing, like, especially in the California sun there at Stanford, at the end of the game, sometimes he would have dried white streaks.
Oh, yeah, from the salt condensing.
Of salt.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, it tastes like salt. You're going to tell me, because you read in a book and you're a professor, that this isn't happening? So anyway, I guess I was one of those iconoclastic skeptic people. Anyway, maybe I always have been. So, but the point is, though, that in this system, you have this retrograde communication that is then modifying signals. So when we call stress is from what would I call it? It's a self-centered perspective. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. It's stress to be yelled at. It is stress to listen to ambulances and sirens and police, gunfire or something. Well, to somebody who's from Japan, hearing somebody yelling might be very different from listening to somebody in Italy, somebody in Rome, versus somebody in Tokyo, because the cultures are different.
And in the horn beep with the car, beep 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 beep.
Right.
In certain cultures, that is not rude. In LA, it could get you shot.
Right. Same thing in Detroit.
But in a different area, it's polite, and it's and it's kind of like the nonverbal, like, well, two beeps is a nice beep, beep beep, versus the beep. Right. Like the beep is a nice. It's like, here I am, the beep, and everybody's going beep, 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 and so the response is different. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying, and so then if you have the same stimulus, whether it's a horn honking, or a punch in the face, to label it as a stress is a judgment based on what I think the normal state is.
So perhaps a better word would be input. It's an input.
Yeah. So there's a stimulus that's coming in.
Yeah.
So now that it's just a stimulus, if we modify the stimulus, well, yeah, it's very easy to imagine that somebody hearing a horn honking could think of it as like, oh, that's like music to my ears. I've been in the rainforest so long. This is the thing I missed about being in Manhattan.
Right.
Okay, so they're going to have a big serotonin, whatever, holiday or something,
The old familiar sound of the traffic.
Right. And so this thing that we have about these systems, and we think that we understand them because we look at them in these isolated contexts. Our culture is also an isolated context.
Sure.
And so if I stand outside of that culture, like I said, and I take sides with the plant or take sides with the apparent biology, what it seems to me that the endocannabinoid system is doing is not homeostasis to try and make us all like serene people living in an ashram in, Northern California, but is trying to get us to be able to work within our chosen environment and our chosen personality and lifestyle and not die today.
Huh.
Okay?
Very
so good. If this guy's choosing to be a boxer and he's getting hit in the face and he's getting hit and all that, then the endocannabinoid system is saying, okay, well, this seems to be a pretty regular event, getting hit in the face. And he doesn't seem to like it when he falls down. So we're going to attenuate, we're going to diminish this input stimulus so that it's funny, so that it's that he has pride. I mean, he's proud of getting hit in the face. So it starts to change. And so then this THC or CBD input into that person or the endocannabinoid system modification, the endocannabinoid system is just maybe trying to, let's say, help this boxer stay on his feet.
Mm-hmm. Huh.
Okay. And if you give this boxer THC, depending on the amount, but the amount that people usually think of, then he's on island time. He's going to get hit in the face again and probably get knocked out then for sure.
Now, but you take somebody back to the island. If they're on THC, they may actually never get hit in the face to begin with because they'll be like, hey, cool, man, it's all good.
Right.
It's all good. Well, hey, listen, I wish we had a little bit more time, but I need to wrap things up here. Your insight has been really helpful. We went over some very technical topics today, and I think some other broad general ones. So there's something in here, I think, for a lot of folks. I really appreciate your time. Dr. Karymaitre Aliffe, thank you so much. I'd love to do this again. You had mentioned potentially bringing on in another doc to have a kind of a three-way conversation. But what I really appreciate about your message, Karyemaitre, is that it's resonating with me, first of all, but I don't hear a whole lot of people talking about these types of things in the cannabis space. So thank you for that. How can folks find out more about you or what it is that you're doing?
They can call you on your private cell phone. I'll give it to them right now.
Okay, very good. And if I'm busy or I don't return phone calls, what's another good option?
LinkedIn, I guess.
LinkedIn. Okay. And I'll put a link to that both in the YouTube and in the podcast notes. Thank you so much. Anything you'd like to say before signing off the air here?
Well, I would encourage people that have experienced cannabis but haven't been trained in science to not feel as though they don't know anything about cannabis. There are lots of people that feel like science is the first and final word on everything. And science isn't here to tell us what to do or how to live. It's just here to answer some questions when we don't have the answers already. And so why does one person get paranoid and another person gets high and another person takes the same amount of cannabis and doesn't get high? That's like a really good question for science to answer.
Yeah.
And when you have the answer, that doesn't mean you have to do anything that the scientist said. And they say, well, the reason that you got paranoid is it's okay. It's just an answer. It's not a mandate.
Mm-hmm.
Least of all a mandate from heaven sort of a thing, like in the ancient Chinese tradition. So the one word that is used a lot to slap people in the face is anecdote.
Okay. Anecdotal evidence. Oh, you know what? We need more evidence because we don't really know that cannabis works for pain. Just because your pain went away doesn't mean it works for pain.
Right. And it's the funny thing. I looked it up the other day, Google or whatever, and the word anecdote was defined as relating a real experience, like telling a story, or in other ways relating a real experience that a person has had. They actually use the word real. Anecdotal is completely in the opposite direction. It's saying unsupported by evidence, not factual, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like when you have an anecdote and you tell people, it's like, hey, one time I was down in the Amazon and I was working with some traditional healers, and they gave me this plant called ayahuasca, and they told me that I could try it. That's an anecdote. Anecdotal evidence is that, and they use it a lot for ceremonies. And somebody says, well, we don't know that for sure. It's like, well, why not? Because you're the only one who said it. Well, I'm the only one who's ever been to the Amazon. It's 1642. This is London. Who else is going to tell you? Well, it's just anecdotal evidence. We have to send 100 people down there. Okay, tell you what. I've got this tiger in a cage, just came from Bengal, India. I'm going to let it jump out of the cage on you, and after it bites your head off, we're going to say, we still don't know. We're still not sure. That's just an anecdote. We'll bring some of your colleagues in here from the biochem, medicine, whatever department. They can all line up. Don't run away. If you're running away, you're not being rational. You're not being logical. If you don't know the behavior of a tiger until he's killed at least 10 or 12 of you, then we can say, tigers kill humans. But until then, it's just an anecdote.
Yeah. So fascinating. And it's not just pain that you can notice with cannabis. It's your muscle spasms if you've got MS. Did my anxiety go away? It's really easy to get and gather certain effects. Cannabis makes me hungry. Cannabis helps put me to sleep. Cannabis helps with my nerve pain. Cannabis helps with my nausea. These are things we don't necessarily, we may not know exactly why it's working.
Right.
But on the science side of things, one thing we definitely do know about cannabis is that it has a very low toxicity. I think that
Right.
can be in terms of a therapeutic substance. So, hey, I love chatting with you. I wish we could just keep going on, but I need to bring this to a wrap. Thanks again for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Karyemaitre Aliffe, this is Dr. Jake Felice, Cannabis Matrix Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and we will have Dr. Aliffe back on again with us soon. Thank you so much.
Enjoy your cannabis, Jake.
Thank you. Walk with me as we take a broad-ranging tour of the world of cannabis, from the ancient to the modern, the medical to the recreational, as well as the social, cultural, and political landscapes of this fascinating plant. I am Dr. Jake Felice, and this is the Cannabis Matrix, where cannabis science meets cannabis culture, where recreational meets medical, and where the body's own endocannabinoid system is as much a player as CBD or THC. Welcome.
Well, it was in my childhood days, many long years ago. Now with the Spirit, now of my Savior, I was filled